think we've left that crossroad behind us. As Barbara put in her paper put it, there's been a shift of thinking from the adoption of concepts related to autopoietic and self-regulating or self-reproducing systems. I have some problems with self-regulating, self-reproducing in systems, but still I think that's right. It is now we have to look at the internal organizing processes. I think we have crossed that particular crossroads. We've passed that crossroads. And I think we now think of organization as something that is going on in an organization. Excuse me. We don't think of it any longer as communication in organization, but it's time to concentrate on the flip side of that expression, why it is and how and when organization emerges in and through communication. We've, however, arrived at a new crossroads. And I think what we need to do is break with another tradition, this time one that goes back all the way at least to the 17th century, and I'm sure far earlier. It's a tradition that automatically takes the individual as the starting point of theory building and analysis. The prejudice is deeply enshrined in the whole course of Western thought. We built a whole carpenter's shed full of methods that impel us always to start with the individual as the unit of analysis, experiments focused on individuals and their reactions, surveys that sample individual respondents drawn from a population, macro thinking, micro thinking, really. Communication theory, as it was too long conceived, assumed messages from one person sent to a sender to another person, a receiver. Accumulations of messaging produced networks. It was all about knowledge and the construction of knowledge and so on. I hope these shibboleths no longer have the upper hand that they once did. There's a great deal now, a really important amount of fascinating work, fascinating research going on. It's modeled on ethnographic studies of social process and on conversational process. I find this work very, very exciting, and I'm delighted to see it so well represented at this conference. But I think it's still true, as Bob Craig has reminded us, that we don't have truly an explicit, well-conceived theory of communication. What I'm going to try to do is to outline some of the things we need to get clear about in order to free ourselves from the all too well ingrained and encrusted in tradition habit of going back to the individual as the social unit. It's what Elizabeth calls the default assumption. If communication is a difficult science to master, theoretically and empirically, it's because it runs counter to, contradicts this long-established prejudice. You know, our field's not that one with a long history. So if the individual is not the basic unit of analysis, then what is? I would again refer to Barbara's excellent analysis. Here's how Barbara put it. Network theory, I'm quoting from the paper you sent in earlier, not your talk. I think, though it's the same material. Network theory, she wrote, has traditionally assumed the existence of actors who forge connections. And she offers an alternative approach, which she calls ActionNet, that assumes instead the primacy of organizing. Rather than privilege individual actors, ActionNet, she writes, reverts this assumption, suggesting that connections between and among actions, when stabilized, are used to construct the identities of actors. Actors and organizations, she writes, are outcomes rather than inputs of organizing. All I can say is, hear, hear. I applaud. She points out you can only become a publisher by publishing. And publishing is already a web of connections, of relationships. I could not agree more. One of the best teachers I ever had was at the University of London. Actually, I was studying literature then. A linguist named Ferguson pointed out to me something I've never forgotten. When children learn to speak, it's not the words they start with. They learn the rhythmic patterns of speech before they can handle words. And they learn how to use language in context, a relational context. When you watch parents teaching their children to speak, as she did, you see that what the kids are learning is attitude. We were, after all, born into a situation we've had to learn how to swim in a pool of relationships if we are to thrive. This means that we had to know the right sound pattern to register our needs and who to address themselves to. We mastered those skills well before we could mouth the words intelligibly. The first one typically being, as any parent knows, no. So I propose a new slogan. It all begins and ends as a relationship in a context. It was Harvey Sachs, after all, who pointed out that identities don't come packaged as individually. They come as sets. Mother, daughter, uncle, aunt, employer, employee, master, servant, doctor, patient, lawyer, client, so on and on and on. Relationships, as Goffman in his 1959 book put it, we put on a face, we try out a line. And depending on how well things go, we establish an identity in a context. The famous identity crisis that so many young people traverse as they grow up is, when you think about it, mainly a quest to find a relational context in which to flourish and grow. The other crisis, the midlife crisis, is the downside of that quest. It indexes dissatisfaction with the matrix of relationships in which one has become embedded over the years. This is not, by the way, to deny the reality of the individual experience. Far from it. It's just to set our priorities straight. As Barbara Czajkowska says, it's the connections that construct identities rather than the other way around. Though I prefer to think of them as relating or relationships. One of the issues that I've heard discussed a lot at this conference is the question of agent, agency, actor, and that neologism, actant or actant. I'm not sure how to say it in English. It's maybe actant or actant or acting. I don't know. It's a term that Bruno Latour introduced to the language, the term actant. I'm going to call it actant. He was clear about the rationale and the source. The rationale is to avoid having to use actors for non-humans because it's counterintuitive. It's an uncommon use of the word. It would be confusing. So the word actant, he wrote, is a borrowing from semiotics, and it's not much of a secret. It's a secret de polichinelle, as it said in French, an open secret. Where that came from, it was the semiotician Algirdas Julien Grémas. It was Grémas who first drew the distinction between actor and actant.